Good evening and welcome. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Thank you for navigating the traffic and the weather. We are so happy to have you here this evening. I'm Stacy Fields, the Director of Human Resources here at Howard County Library System. It is my honor tonight to welcome our special guest for this evening, Mr. Howard French. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping remarks. If you would, please silence your cell phones to avoid disruptions during tonight's presentation. Also, please take a moment to note the nearest exit in the unlikely event of an emergency. Tomorrow you will receive an email survey and we encourage you to complete it. It only takes a couple of minutes, but your feedback is very important to us. Following Mr. French's presentation tonight, we will have copies of Born in Blackness available for purchase and signing. Thank you to our community bookstore partner, The Last Word Bookstore, for partnering with us on this event. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to share with you that HCLS has launched a new initiative, Brave Voices, Brave Choices. We believe true and lasting change requires true and lasting intention to learn, grow, and to act. Brave Voices, Brave Choices is the driver for that in Howard County. We invite you to learn through our resources, share your stories as part of our story gathering and sense-making project, and participate in our events. Part of this initiative is the Equity Resource Center here at the Central Branch, where we are gathered tonight. We invite you to explore our resources. Our special guest tonight is Howard W. French. Mr. French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University and a former New York Times bureau chief for the Caribbean and Central America, West and Central Africa, Tokyo, and Shanghai. He is the author of 5 books, including Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, which poses the question, what if, instead of relegating Africa to the remote outskirts of our global story, we put Africa and Africans at the very center of our thinking about the origins of modernity? Please join me in welcoming Mr. Howard W. French to Howard County Library System.
Thank you very much, Stacy, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for turning out tonight, despite the rain. It's lovely to be with you in a library like this. One of my first events for this book back in the fall was at the Brooklyn Public Library, but because of COVID, there haven't been a lot of library events per se. And I'm a lover of libraries, and so I'm very happy to be with you in a venue like this tonight. I want a lot of what I had sort of expected to say at the very outset was actually captured in Stacy's words, which was nice and shows that you're really attentive to the message of the book. But there's kind of a locomotive or kind of a string of railroad cars lined up in the title of the book: Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World. And then there's more: 1471 to the Second World War. And I want to achieve a few things in the little bit of time we have to talk about the book. First, I want to tell you how I came about taking on this story, or the challenge of recounting this history. And then I want to talk about the terms of that locomotive of a title that are centered on the modern world and what we mean by the making of the modern world. This is really a book about the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world, or what is often spoken about in a kind of glossy, superficial way as the West. And the West, I'd like to define at the outset here as a kind of consortium or a condominium that exists today, familiar to us today, but which came together around the Atlantic, between Atlantic-facing Europe, meaning the countries that have shorelines on the Atlantic Ocean in Europe, and what became the major colonies of European countries in the so-called New World, the United States being the biggest, of course, but didn't start out as a very big or very important colony, which may come as a surprise to some of you. So the making of the modern world is about the making of the West. But I said I would tell you how I came upon this story, and that brings me to speak about my, as a correspondent for the New York Times took me around this Atlantic rim. First of all, I'm from the United States, not far from here. I was born in Washington, D.C. My family has roots in Virginia. I tell a bit of my family's history in the margins of this book. Actually, I begin with some of my wife's family's history. My wife is from the country of Ghana in West Africa, where a lot of this narrative picks up, and I'll come to that in a minute. And then late in the book, I come to my own family's history, and specifically my mother's family, my mother's side of the family's history in Virginia, as the children, descendants of enslaved people who were the property of an early governor of the state of Virginia. And the fruit of this couple between a powerful man and an enslaved woman is a familiar American story. It's the story that we all, perhaps all of you, will. One of the most famous stories we have that was belatedly recognized and verified and acknowledged, publicly speaking, around the life of Thomas Jefferson. So that's how the first instance of how I came to this narrative. This was slavery, enslavement, the process of extraction and of subjugation and of exploitation of human beings was not just goes to the root of who I am, but was a topic of dinner discussion and family discussion and education from an early age in my life, and became a kind of understanding it became a kind of passion for me, not just as an African American or not just as an American, but as somebody who had these stories and who had physical reminders of these stories in my life as a child growing up in rural Virginia. The second thing that brought me to do a book like this, as I said, was my professional life around the rim of the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm from the southern United States, but as a correspondent for the New York Times, I worked in the Caribbean and Latin America, the northern tier of Latin America in specific, meaning Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, northern Brazil. And this is really the heartland of the experience of enslavement in the New World. Many Americans, meaning from people from the United States, imagine that the United States was somehow the center of the slave experience. But the United States, I don't wish to diminish the importance of slavery to our history in this country, but the United States was, relatively speaking, a mere appendage to a much bigger, more vast experience of subjugation and exploitation through enslavement in the New World. The most important country in this regard, initially the most important colony in this regard, was Brazil, which had 10 times as many people brought there from Africa as we did here in what became the United States. But even a tiny island like Barbados, which is 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles in terms of its square miles, had as many people brought from Africa, and for the most part, worked to death in the pursuit of profit for Europeans, as the entire United States did. And so I was a correspondent in the Caribbean and in the northern tier of Latin America, and I began to come in contact with these broader histories of enslavement and of the Atlantic world through those experiences. After that, I was sent by the New York Times to West Africa and covered West and Central Africa. Altogether, I've worked in Africa for about a decade, as meaning resident in Africa, but I've been traveling to Africa throughout my entire life. And I don't want to bore you with all of the details of that story, but this began long before I became a journalist, when my family moved to Africa when I was in college. My father was a medical doctor working in West Africa, and my younger siblings and my parents moved to West Africa, and this was my introduction, my first introduction to that part of the world. And it seized me, and so all of these elements kind of put me on the track to where we meet today. The making of the West, the story of the making of the West, however, came to me in an entirely, unexpectedly, and an entirely different part of the world. My career at the New York Times, after having worked in the parts of the world I described to you, the Caribbean, Latin America, West and Central Africa, I was sent to East Asia. I was sent first to Japan, lived in Japan for 5 years, and then from Japan sent to China and lived in China for 6 years. And at the end of that experience, I wrote a book about China and Chinese history. And in the research of that book, I came across something or some things that astounded me. As somebody who had already traveled widely in the Atlantic world that I've described to you, the Atlantic Basin, the New World, so to speak, and who thought he knew the history of the transatlantic slave trade and of the making of the, if you hear me say New World, imagine scare quotes of the New World, the making of the New World. I learned astounding things in the research of a book about China. So what were those things? I learned that in the 15th century, Portuguese explorers, for lack of a more convenient word, spent multiple decades seeking contact and political relations and wealth in Africa. I didn't know this. I'm a well-read person, I think. I'm a well-traveled person, and it took me all the way to China before I encountered doing archival research for a book about Chinese history, trying to understand the first contacts between Europeans, first substantial contacts in the modern, so-called modern age between Europeans and Chinese. I learned that the Portuguese, long before they reached China or India, dwelled in the world of Africa, and that the world of Africa was their purpose. It was their goal. So why did this seize me so much? This seized me because the traditional way we are taught about the making of the modern world and our common arrival, all of us, everyone who is here today, everyone almost anywhere in the world today, how we arrived in the modern age, goes like this. Sometime in the 15th century, some subset of Europeans, mostly concentrated in Iberia, meaning the peninsula where Spain and Portugal are located, decided that they should seek maritime trade with the East. And the East can be defined variously. In the traditional narrative, it usually means India. And then it was expanded to mean China. And they were seeking to reach the East, we are told, in the conventional narratives. This is, I'm sure there are books in this, in this library that tell this story this way. I'm sure that the curricula that your children and that you yourselves have learned and your children and your grandchildren have learned or are learning, for the most part, tell this story this way. But the narrative goes like this, that in the 15th century, meaning in the 1400s, the Europeans, and especially the Iberians, became hell-bent on finding a sea path to Asia. And if Africa comes up in this story at all, and usually it does not, in the traditional narratives, in the junior high school history textbooks, in most of the books that I assume will be found in this library, if Africa is not mentioned at all, but if it's mentioned as an obstacle. Africa is mentioned as a place of no inherent interest that simply must be circumnavigated. The Europeans are desperate to reach Asia, and there's this vast obstacle in their way called Africa, and the entire problem is, how do we get around Africa? Is this Africa something that ever ends? Like, it's this thing that must be somehow overcome, and it seems endless to them. That's how it's presented in the traditional narratives. So when I was researching a book about Chinese history and looking into archival accounts of the first European maritime contacts with China, I discover accounts of the Portuguese, and I'm not the first person to discover this, by the way. I don't wish to give that impression. But I encountered, for the first time in my experience, contemporaneous writings of Portuguese navigators who began exploring the coast of West Africa in the 1440s, who were not trying to get to Asia at all. They were trying to get to Africa. And once they discovered key points of interest in Africa, they didn't rush on to Asia. They spent the remainder of the 15th century engaging deeply in Africa and eventually discovering sources of great wealth in Africa and extracting great wealth from Africa, not through in this period, the period we're talking about, the 15th century, not through subjugation of Africans, not through mastery, military or otherwise, of Africans, but through trade and diplomacy with Africa. This was astounding to me. It presents a number of new understandings of the path that we all followed to get here today. First of all, the traditional accounts would have us believe that Africans were primitive, that Europeans were naturally superior, that anywhere Europeans and Africans came into contact, the Europeans obviously dominated. We just sort of quickly rush to those kinds of assumptions, and we think of Africa as being a kind of blank space, and so if there are people there, of course, they don't have much civilization worth thinking about. There's no great achievement, there's no great sources of wealth, there's nothing much of interest there. And so I'm going to back up and go to the prior century to tell you a story that I begin my book with, which should help you understand why it is that the Europeans, in fact, beginning in the 14th century, the 1300s, long before they ever reached West Africa, got into their minds this idea that Africa should be important to them. And this story takes us to a kingdom in the center of West Africa called Mali, which overlaps with the modern-day nation of Mali. And in the very beginning years of the 1300s, meaning we don't know the exact year, but presumably the first 5 years of the 14th century, so between 1300 and 1305, thereabouts, an emperor of the Mali Empire decides that he gives himself a mission of trying to discover what lies on the far side, the far western side of the Atlantic Ocean. Stop, okay? This is more than 150 years before Christopher Columbus. There is a king in a West African kingdom called Mali who has determined that there must be land on the far side of, they didn't use the name Atlantic Ocean, but the great ocean that we recognize as the Atlantic Ocean, and that it should be his mission to try to discover those lands. I'll tell you why we know this in a minute. This isn't fantasy, this isn't some latter-day reconstruction, this isn't Afrocentric history, somebody trying to embellish things. And we can determine this with certainty. So this ruler's name was Abu Bakr II. In the first 5 years of the 14th century, he commissions a bunch of boats. I'm not using the word ship deliberately because sailing, tall mast sail ship technology was not in use in West Africa in this time. And so a large number of boats under the king's commission set off to try to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and only one boat returns. And as it happens, it's the boat that the leader of the expedition commanded himself. He presents himself before the king. He says, "We've met with great disaster at sea. There were currents converging from the northeast and from the northwest and from the southwest very violently, and they sunk almost all the boats save for mine." And the king, Abu Bakr II, instead of being discouraged, says, we're not going to relent in our pursuit of discovery across the ocean. I'm going to commission an even larger convoy of boats, and I'm going to set out at the head of this exploratory venture myself. And so a few years later, after all the boats had been built and assembled, Abu Bakr II sets out at sea with a vast number of these boats and is never seen again. So before I tell you how we know this, I have to tell you how it could be that a 14th century king in West Africa, this place that's presented as a mere obstacle on the map by Europeans in our traditional histories, could have gotten it into his mind that there's land on the far side of the ocean. Mali was an Islamic kingdom. Malian kings had already, for a couple of hundred years, engaged in pilgrimages to Mecca. Malians at the level of the royal family and the elite were literate in the Arab language and had holy scriptures from the Muslim religion. Muslim scientists in Arabia, in Egypt, and in Persia, already from the 8th century, had proven mathematically that the earth was round. And so we are taught that Columbus is how we learned that the world is round. which is, of course, not true. Actually, Greeks had worked out mathematically that the world is round as well, but that knowledge was lost in the Middle Ages in Europe. But since the 8th century, independently, at least that far back, Arab and Persian mathematicians and geographers had proven this. And so, being Muslim, the kings of Mali were exposed to this learning. And so Abu Bakr II has an idea: if the world is round, if you go that way across the ocean, you're bound to encounter some kind of land at some point, and maybe even return to your point of origin. So we know this story because, very interestingly, in 1324, Abu Bakr II's successor, a king named Mansa Musa, himself sets off on a great journey. This time he doesn't head out at sea. He heads out on pilgrimage. As I've said, this was a custom of the Malian emperors, to Cairo and to Mecca. That's a 3,500-mile trip across the Sahara Desert. And he does so at the head, Mansa Musa does, at the head of an extraordinarily large procession, said to have contained 60,000 people. Mansa Musa is carrying with him, at the head of this procession, 18 tons of pure gold. Mali was a gold superpower in this era. There is a predecessor kingdom to Mali that dates back itself also to the 9th or 8th century called Ghana, which existed in virtually the same geography in the Sahelian region of Africa. This could lend to a little bit of confusion. I'm going to talk about the country of Ghana in a few minutes. The present-day country of Ghana lies in a different spot on the coast of West Africa. We're talking about inland West Africa, the great bulge of West Africa. Prior to Mali, there was a place called Ghana, and these two kingdoms, Ghana first and then Mali, sort of sit astride some of the greatest gold deposits in the world, even today in the world, and had been traditionally the source of about 2/3 of the gold that made its way eventually across the Sahara Desert into Europe. This was Europe's most important supply of gold. The Europeans just didn't know where it came from. And so Mansa Musa sets out in 1324, pilgrimage to Mecca, stops in Cairo, spends 3 months in Cairo, lodged at the foot of one of the great pyramids, and distributes 18 tons of gold, pure gold. Gold powder, gold bullion, gold nuggets, gold bricks, in acts of patronage and religious devotion, just gives out more gold than anybody has ever imagined in the possession of a single person at once, at any time in history. Actually, up until now, nobody's ever heard of an individual controlling that much gold. This has an astounding effect, economically speaking, in the Eastern Mediterranean and throughout what we call sometimes in modern parlance, the Middle East. The price of gold collapses. So much gold has been distributed that gold becomes worth only a fraction of its prior value. Silver becomes more expensive than gold, which is a reversal of the traditional ratios between those two metals. And this second pilgrimage, this second great voyage, the first being of Abu Bakr II, trying to get across the Atlantic, and the second by Mansa Musa carrying 18 tons of gold, they're linked in purpose. Both of these rulers are trying to overcome the middlemen who had controlled the access to European markets, the middlemen of North Africa, tribes and kingdoms that existed in the Maghreb region of North Africa, present-day Algeria and Morocco, that sat astride the trade routes to Europe. And so because you couldn't trade with Europe without crossing through those lands, those political kingdoms in the Maghreb region of North Africa were able to impose giant commissions on the trade of gold. And so the Malians wanted to cut out the middlemen and find a road to a market that they could control themselves in order to have the maximum amount of profit possible. And so Abu Bakr II seeks land across the sea, thinking maybe there must be civilizations on the other side of the ocean I can trade directly with. And Mansa Musa does an end run around North Africa and goes to Egypt, thinking that the Mamluk Empire there would offer him another trade outlet for his gold and that would allow him to escape the control of the North Africans. That didn't happen, and we don't have time to talk about why that didn't happen right now. These stories are told in my book, but something else fantastic happened, phenomenal happened, epical happened, something that sort of swung the hinge of history in ways that I want to make clear to you. When someone distributes 18 tons of gold in a short period of time in a small geography like the area around Cairo and the Eastern Mediterranean, people notice, and word spread very quickly into Europe that something phenomenal has just happened in Egypt. Some black cat, excuse me to speak in modern argot, is like the richest guy we've ever heard of, and he says he's from a place called Mali, and we don't know where Mali is, but we have heard that he's just distributed 18 tons of gold, and so we better figure out where Mali is, because this seems like an important person to get to know and place to trade with. This fire that's lit in the minds of the Europeans, and especially the Iberians, is the fire that starts the modern age. Map makers in Iberia begin obsessively trying to figure out where Mali might be. And at first they're being very speculative about this, but little by little you see the designs of their maps improving in accuracy and finally resulting in one of the most famous and most important maps in world history, which figures on the cover of my book, called the Catalan Atlas, which shows Mansa Musa, this black emperor of Mali, sitting astride a solid gold throne, carrying in one hand a golden scepter and another a solid gold orb in the Sahel region, that vast bulge of inland West Africa, receiving visitors on camelback who have come to trade with him for his gold. And so the Europeans, the Iberians who draw these maps now know that they have a general idea where the gold is located, and it becomes their obsession to find it. And it becomes their obsession to find it for very specific historical reasons. The Ottomans take over the Silk Road routes via the land that the Italians and other Europeans had applied for their trade with the East overland for centuries. And you can't really trade that way with the East anymore. And so sources of luxury goods and other sorts of commercial wealth had been cut off by the Muslims for the Europeans. And so the Iberians say, let's find the gold in Africa. And in the 1440s, the Portuguese take the lead in this effort under a ruler, not a ruler, actually, a prince of the ruling Aviz dynasty, a man who some of you will have heard of, named Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator begins to commission a series of voyages down the coast of West Africa, which take an enormous amount of time to make progress, because the Europeans were very superstitious, because their naval technology was limited, and because the Portuguese were very poor. The Portuguese were a fairly recently born kingdom. They had split off from what I'm going to call, for convenience sake, Spain. Spain was actually a complicated set of kingdoms. Anyway, the Portuguese under the Aviz break away from Spain. They don't have any economic products worth mentioning of their own other than salt and cork and dried fish. They're cut off from trade with the Mediterranean, which had been the principal traditional source of commercial wealth in that part of the world. And so the Portuguese start building ships little by little, saying, we've got to find this Mansa Musa character, or the source of the gold in Mali. And little by little, overcoming their technological limitations in sailing and navigation, and their superstitions about the world being flat and falling off the edge, or the equatorial region of Africa being too hot to survive in. They believed all these sorts of things. They inch their way down the West African coast until the year 1470, which is actually after the death of Henry the Navigator. Let me just pause to say. So I started out with the traditional account of how these stories are told: junior high school education, the age of exploration, Africa maybe not mentioned, or if it's mentioned, Africa just being an obstacle that has to be overcome. The Portuguese spent decades in the 15th century trying to find the source of wealth in Africa. This is not a one-night stand. This is not a passing inspiration. This is the real obsession. And in 1471, they arrive in a place on the coast of what is now modern Ghana, which is in a different place from the Ghana Empire that I described earlier, near Nigeria. They arrived on the coast of modern Ghana. It was not modern Ghana yet, but at that spot, in a place that they named Elmina, which means the mine. And they named it the mine because as soon as they docked their ships there, they noticed that even ordinary people, nominally poor people, were wearing gold. Gold was so abundant in this place they had landed that it was a commonplace thing. Everybody could have gold. And it didn't take them very long to discover that, of course, there were abundant sources of trade in gold there. And so they called this place Elmina. And they built a fort there. And that fort occupies a big part of the early narrative of this book and exists today. And it's known and remembered today for other purposes. It became, 150 years later, a major site of the slave trade, but it was built by the Portuguese in the 1480s to secure, with the permission of the locals, not through conquest, but with the permission of the locals, to secure a trade in gold between Europe and Africa. So I've said what was the first spark of the modern age. It was Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca, in which he stops in Cairo and he distributes all this gold. This is the second great spark of the modern age. The Portuguese build this fort at Elmina, I should say fort, fortified trading station at Elmina. Within 5 years, as much as 1/3 of the entire crown revenue of the Kingdom of Portugal is coming from trade with Elmina. That's how much trade they were getting in gold from Ghana. The Portuguese named their treasury, the very treasury of the kingdom, they named after Africa. This is not people desperate to find Asia. This is people who have had a eureka experience in Africa. They named their treasury, which was housed in the royal palace, the House of Guinea. Guinea was the generic word for Black Africa used by Portuguese in this period. And so right away, gold constitutes this kind of lifeline of the Portuguese kingdom, which was the Spanish wanted to reconquer Portugal, and suddenly the Portuguese have found a great source of economic sustenance and wealth in Ghana at Elmina, and they're off to the races. Why is this so important historically? This is important for multiple reasons, and I can't explore all of them in the quick amount of time we have allotted, but I want to tick through 2 or 3 of them. The first of them is that the Portuguese, I told you, were poor. All they had was cork, salt, and dried fish as economic products. Now they're able to trade for gold with Africans, and they're getting rich. This allowed Portugal to have a strong currency for the first time, a viable currency in Europe for the first time in its history. And this allows the Portuguese to begin to build ships. It took them decades to get to Ghana because they didn't have the money to build a lot of ships. Now they have wealth and they can build ships. All of the great Portuguese explorations, which become much more famous than this one, even though this was the key event in this era, like the discovery of India, or the discovery of Brazil, or the circumnavigation of the world, all of those things were made possible by the connection with wealth in Ghana at Elmina. The other thing the other sort of crucial impact of this discovery in 1471, a year that appears in the long subtitle of my book, is that the Spanish, as I've emphasized a couple of times already in this talk, coveted Portugal. They wanted to reabsorb Portugal under their authority. And they saw that the Portuguese had discovered all of this wealth in Africa. And so they tried to Spain is 10 times bigger than Portugal, almost literally, right? And so the Spanish tried to beat up the Portuguese, to seize the trade in African gold away from the Portuguese, and sent a maritime convoy down the coast of Africa themselves to confront the Portuguese. And the Portuguese had intelligence reports about this in advance and were able to lay in ambush. Even though their forces were much weaker, they had the element of surprise and were able to lay in ambush for the Spanish fleet and defeat the Spanish fleet in a battle off of Africa that none of you have ever heard about, which was pivotal in world history. And this chastened the Spanish, and they had to give up the idea of conquering the Portuguese overseas holdings at Elmina, where the Portuguese had built a fort. But the Spanish got another idea based on primitive European ideas of geography and of geology in this era. I say primitive, I don't mean any insult to anybody, but people didn't understand many things back then in terms of science, right? And one of the notions that both the Portuguese and the Spanish shared was that if gold was so present in a place like Elmina, in nowadays what we call Ghana, then that must mean that gold is distributed everywhere in the world according to latitude. And so Ghana, the coast of Ghana is about 5 degrees north of the equator. The Portuguese said, this must mean that gold is distributed in a narrow band all around the place, just north and just south of the equator. And so the myth history that we're taught, that's in the books here and in our school curricula, say the Portuguese were rushing to Asia. The Portuguese were actually rushing to continue exploring Africa in that narrow band, thinking with this primitive notion of geology that gold must be distributed like that, right? But more intriguingly, because of what we know happened subsequently, the Spanish also got this idea. The Spanish had tried to conquer the Portuguese fleet, failed, and the Spanish king and queen said, Ferdinand and Isabella said, there's this crazy guy named Columbus who has been knocking on our door for the last 10 years trying to tell us that if we would only finance him, he would sail west and discover across the Atlantic Ocean and discover a route to Japan and China. We're not sure about his Japan and China business or whether or not the world is actually round like he says, but we know that we want to discover gold in the tropics too. And so what would it cost us? Let's give this guy Columbus a little money, enough to buy 3 ships, and let him sail off in another direction in the hope that he will be able to discover gold for us, just like the Portuguese discovered in the tropics. And if you look at Columbus's diaries from his earliest voyages, at every stop in the messages that he composed, actually addressed to the Spanish crown, was how much gold he had discovered. And he didn't really discover a lot, but this was the most important thing he mentioned in every single missive that he wrote. How much gold I discovered. And that is the key to understanding what the Spanish were all about. They were trying to not let the Portuguese run away with the discovery of gold in what they imagined to be a narrow geographic band in the world containing all the gold. So as you can understand from this story, it was this discovery of gold by the Portuguese in West Africa that sets all of these things in motion. We learn about the idea of Columbus and the sailing west across the Atlantic as if it existed in isolation. This guy just got it into his head to do this, and the Spanish backed him. It all originates because of prior Portuguese engagement with Africa. I just have a few minutes. I need to compress a lot of history here, so I'm going to go really, really quickly. The Portuguese themselves continuing to explore Africa in the idea of finding gold within this narrow latitudinal band in the tropics, discovered in the late 1470s, early 1480s, an uninhabited island called Sao Tome off the coast of Central Africa. Sao Tome is almost exactly on the equator. It's volcanic. It has heavy seasonal rains and extraordinarily rich soils. The Portuguese plant on an experimental basis there in Sao Tome sugarcane. The Portuguese had been planting sugarcane just for a very short period of time, much further to the north in the Atlantic, in places like Madeira and the Canary Islands, to extraordinary profit. Refined sugar was a rarity in Europe at this time. Only the richest people, kings and queens, could afford to consume it. So amazing profits could be made in the trade for sugar. The Portuguese plant sugar in Sao Tome, and they discover that sugar grows like wildfire in Sao Tome. It's the perfect ecology for sugar. The only problem who has commercially planted sugar has always used slave labor or forced labor because sugar is a brutal crop to grow. It must be planted tightly together in very wet soils, in tropical places where there are mosquitoes transmitting diseases, and the leaves of the sugarcane plant are extremely sharp and cut you off. So you're tromping through muddy fields, tightly planted spaces, getting cut up by these things and bitten by mosquitoes that are killing you. Right, and so nobody wants to grow sugar, and slavery and sugar had already had a deep historical association. And so the Portuguese go to the coast of Africa and begin trading with African kingdoms there for slaves, to buy human beings, to put to work on Sao Tome. And this is the birth of the plantation as a modern economic institution. And I'm going to complicate this word plantation. They're born off the coast of Africa, right there in Sao Tome. And I want to use a different term to help you understand what a plantation actually is. I would prefer the name prison industrial labor camps. And that is because these people are, these unfortunate people who have been put into chains are being supervised and punished in a quasi-military fashion. They're prisoners at a work camp. And essentially, in fact, worked to death. This system is perfected. It's invented and perfected in Sao Tome. It crosses the Atlantic by accident. Within a decade of being invented in Sao Tome by the Portuguese, as they continued, before they reached Asia, as they continued to explore Africa, they're zigzagging down the coast of Africa in this navigational method called tacking, and they bump into the coast of what they would call Brazil. And this is how, they were not looking for Brazil. They were looking for further places to explore in Africa, and they hit Brazil, and they take over Brazil. And within the space of a few decades, the planting of this crop called sugarcane and the economic model of prison industrial labor camp, glorified and prettified under the word plantation, transit the Atlantic, and soon the transatlantic slave trade takes on an amplitude that will change all of history, and which is the third great motor that has put us on the path to where we are today. I'm going to wrap up in less than 5 minutes. I know I have minus 5 minutes to talk. What happens in Brazil is absolutely astounding. So first, the Portuguese tried to use native inhabitants to grow sugar. They're making incredible profits on sugar. Because the natives had no resistance to European diseases, the natives die in extraordinary numbers. This becomes impossible for the Portuguese to sustain. And so they start sourcing human beings as slaves in Africa and bringing them across in great numbers across the Atlantic. By 1570, the entire sugar economy of Brazil is conducted through African labor in prison industrial slave camps. By the year 1600 or 1610, thereabouts, Portugal has made more money in sugar than Spain has made in the much more famous conquest that we all learn about in high school history of the Aztecs and the Incas, where the conquistadors stride into the mountains and defeat these great kingdoms and then steal all of their gold and silver. Portugal has made more money in growing sugar through the prison industrial labor camp system, this absolutely pivotal modern institution, than Spain acquired through conquest. This institution then transits its way up the broad arc of the Caribbean. In 1630, the English, very much latecomers to this game compared to Spain and Portugal, take over the island of Barbados. The English copy. The English are actually a weak country then. Spain is the great power of Europe. Portugal is much more powerful than England in this time. The English take over Barbados, and they emulate the Portuguese, what they had done in Sao Tome first and then in Brazil, bringing Africans in great number to grow sugar. By the middle of the 17th century, meaning the 1650s, already in the space of 20, 30 years, the English have made so much money that they are able to build ships in sufficient quantity to take on the Spanish. And they defeat the Spanish and seize Jamaica from Spain. Jamaica had been a Spanish island up until this time. Barbados, 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles, is tiny compared to Jamaica. So now England has Jamaica and is growing huge amounts of sugar on Jamaica. This is the proximate source of England's birth as an imperial nation. This is where England gets the wherewithal to eventually become a great conquering, colonizing civilization that eventually takes over 1/3 of the world. I'm jumping forward. France is even further behind, lagging behind this exploitation of these methods, but it finally gets into the game. In 1720, the French begin to copy all of these methods of the prison industrial labor camp system, bringing Africans across the ocean in huge numbers to work them to death. The average life expectancy from moment of arrival on the soil of a Caribbean island growing as a grower of sugar was about 5 years. The French begin doing this in 1720. By 1781, their colony on the island of Hispaniola, which is where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located, their colony was called Saint-Domingue. By 1781, Saint-Domingue is producing 1/3 of all of France's external trade. This is the century of, this is France's golden century. 1/3 of its overseas trade is from the single colony of Saint-Domingue, 1/3 of the island of Hispaniola. Africans are producing this wealth for Spain, for France. The Africans in 1791 say enough, and they rise up and they revolt and they overthrow the French imperial masters and their owners, in effect, the people who operated the sugar plantations. Against all odds, the Africans on what becomes Haiti defeat the French. But that's not where the story stops. The Spanish, who controlled the other 2/3 of the island, said, we can't let this engine of wealth go, slip out of Europe's hands. We must take over Saint-Domingue. And so the Spanish invade from next door, and the Africans defeat the Spanish. At this point, the English from Jamaica and other points in the Caribbean say, look, there's too much wealth in growing sugar under this kind of slave economy, the prison industrial labor camp system. We're going to send our ships. The English send the largest convoy in the history of England up until this point across the Atlantic to try to defeat the Africans. The Africans win. Finally, Napoleon tries one more time. The French then send also their largest convoy in the history of their country up until that point across the Atlantic to try for a second time to seize control of Haiti, and the Africans win. In 1804, this culminates in the birth of the second independent nation in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, the nation of Haiti. And this is not just an extraordinary victory for human freedom and a victory by Africans who were determined not to live in bondage to others, but a victory in ideas and in politics. The Haitians were the first people in the history of the world to enact and to put into place the most important idea, the most important foundation of the Enlightenment, and that idea being that no people shall enslave any other and that no race should ever be considered superior to any other, that rights should be equal according to each and all, irrespective of race. This happens in the Haitian Constitution in 1804. I was born, I'm old enough to have been born at a time where that wasn't even true in this country. This happens in Haiti in 1804. I'm wrapping up now. There's a lot more history in this book. I'm sorry, it's hard to compress it into 40 minutes, but this has an immense impact in the young United States. The Southern slaveholding class that dominated American politics in the early period of our history in this country took fright. They said, if black people can rise up and defeat France, Spain, Spain, England, and then France again, then it's probably not a good idea to have too many black people concentrated in Virginia and in Georgia and in South Carolina and places like that. We must find a way to disperse them for our own survival's sake. And this drives Thomas Jefferson to negotiate with Napoleon, who has just almost gone bankrupt trying to control Haiti, for the purchase of lands that would double the size of the United States overnight. And this is what is called the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, the United States acquires all or part of what would become 15 states and doubles in size. And an immense migration, the second great migration of black people in the modern age, is then put into place, moving by foot for the most part, Africans out of the old South, the slave lands of Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, et cetera, to the Mississippi Valley, where they are put into production under this old model, the prison industrial labor camp system, for the production of the next great commodity of the modern age. That commodity, as I think many of you can guess, is cotton. Cotton in this era replaces sugar as the great engine of economic life of the modern world. It is the ingredient sine qua non, indispensable of the Industrial Revolution. We are told that the Industrial Revolution is the kind of result of ingenuity of people in England who figured out how to organize workers together in what became known as a factory, using looms and mass labor and discipline and specialization and things like that. None of that would have happened without the cotton grown by Africans with the force of the lash, in chains, in military industrial labor camp circumstances in the Mississippi Valley. By the way, the Africans were also worked in very specialized ways and played an important but unrecognized role in the invention of what we came to know as industrialization. Final thing. In 1791, the United States produced something like 20,000 bales of cotton. By 1830, the United States produced something in the order of 20 to 30 million pounds of cotton. In 1860, at the start of the American Civil War, by that time, the United States produced 2 billion pounds of cotton. Can you imagine? You think about the progression here. A few thousand bales to 20 million pounds to 2 billion pounds of cotton. Cotton was, by a very long distance, the most important export of the United States. All sorts of other industries flowed from this cotton economy: banking, transportation, insurance, real estate, mortgages held on the bodies of slaves. The American economy boomed in this period, and this is, in fact, what was responsible for the American rise in the 19th century to put it on its path to become the most powerful economy in the world. So I think I'll stop there. I'm actually in need of a sip of water. I know there will be questions. I've left out a lot. I hope that those of you who read the book will savor the additional detail. Whoa, that's a message. But it's been a great pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to your questions. Apologies for going over time.
It's raining. We can't go anywhere anyway.
Thank you. Anyone? Yes, Ali.
Can you talk a little bit about how what you're talking about in terms of the military prison forced labor camps, how that's informed our industrial prison system now, both nationally and globally? I'm thinking, I was reading something today about Uyghur people being used to manufacture solar panels in China in forced labor camps, and we have something similar here in the United States. I'm wondering if you can talk about the history of how that system evolved into our current system.
Sure, the very good question, and a difficult question to answer in a compressed fashion, so I'm going to tick off a couple of things, mindful of time. The questioner said, how did this prison industrial labor camp system that I described, my word for plantations, inform or shape present-day prison systems and forced labor systems, if I may paraphrase, okay? I think to answer this, what we need to do is go back to the era called the Reconstruction in the United States. And so after the Civil War, there was a window of time in which during which the South was occupied by Union armies, and relatively progressive political figures began to prevail in political contests in the South, and blacks began to enter into political life and have representation, not just as voters, but to hold office in various places in the South. This window gets shut very quickly as the political coalitions and the major parties in the United States begin to shift, and the occupation of the South ends. As soon as the occupation of the South ends, white political control is restored, and there's a kind of revanchism that takes place. And as this revanchism, or trying to sort of return things to their past form, takes place, state leaders throughout the Old South become obsessed with finding ways of forcing black people into constrained subsidiary economic relations. And they did this through all kinds of devious means. One really good example I find is by defining loitering as a crime, saying if you don't look like you're gainfully employed, you can be arrested. Actually, citizen's arrest, meaning a white person can say, hey, excuse me, I'm going to use the N-word because it's appropriate to this particular topic. Hey, nigger, you don't look like you're working. You're under arrest. And when you get arrested, then under those kinds of circumstances, you can be railroaded into a forced labor situation as effectively as an indentured servant. And so I use the word revanchism before because that means a kind of violent return to the past. And so we had a return to a slavery, a quasi-slavery without using the word slavery, right? This was a way that the white political class in the Deep South, a tool that they used in order to make sure that African American labor stayed close to the land because they needed hands on the land to plant and to harvest their crops. I drove through this. I lived in Miami in the 1980s or early 1990s, and used to take family trips with my wife and sons through that part of the country, what I've called the Old South, and was struck at that time, as recently as the early 1990s, by prison gang labor on highways. They had men in striped uniforms, almost all of them black, with machetes doing prison camp labor. So your question was, how does the prison industrial labor camp system inform more recent types of labor? Well, I think there you have it. You also asked about China. I don't want to make too big a leap in terms of drawing the connections here, but there's been a temptation throughout history to exploit imprisoned labor. The difference with the United States is that we have a racialized underclass that people have, from the very beginning of the history of our country, certain people have worked in very concerted ways, not just to retain them as a political underclass, but to exploit them as an economic underclass. And so extracting labor from people under constrained or forced circumstances like this is a typical classic tool that recurs over and over again.
How did we get this information, this version of history into our American schools?
The question was, how do we get this version of American history into our schools? That's a very good question, and it's something that I lose sleep over. I didn't write this book having worked that out yet, and I didn't start researching this book knowing what political moment this book was going to arrive in. So this book arrived in a political moment I didn't completely anticipate, where we actually have people banning books, right, actively, in a high-profile way, not in the cover of Night, like making a big deal of it, right? When I set out to write this book, I didn't expect we would be there, right? The first thing I want to say is, no historian and no history is the final word, okay? And I want to offer some humility about this. This is not the last word on these topics. There are many topics in my book. What I hope to do is to influence other people at all kinds of levels to pursue their own learning about these things. So this is 600 years of world history that is recounted in my book, and one could write easily 100 other books just by chiseling off pieces of this book and saying, I'm going to make a whole book out of this particular era or this particular phenomena. And so that's part of how I think these ideas spread and how we get some of them more and more introduced into the so-called mainstream of our educational curricula, et cetera. The other thing, although I don't pretend this is the last word in history, I've been very careful. This is a book that has 50 pages of endnotes. The assertions that I make are documented assertions. There's nothing fanciful about anything I've said. And so I think this makes it harder for people to dismiss out of. There will be people who do this, but it makes it harder to dismiss out of hand. And I've been encouraged that at least I've spoken at a few high schools already, but at least at the college level, my book has engaged lots of people already. And so I think that there's a trickle-down effect. That's a bad word in certain contexts that doesn't sound very good, trickle-down. But I think that one can imagine a kind of healthy trickle-down that begins to take place along these lines. But another answer is, this book's in your hands now. This book doesn't belong to me now. This book belongs to its readers. And the readers need to confront, as parents need to be active parents. You have to be understanding what your children are being given to read, and the understandings that those books that they're being given to read are trying to communicate to them about history and how we arrived in the present. And so we all need to be able to have these conversations. So this book is a tool for those purposes. It is a resource for those purposes, for you to say, listen, I'm not really sure that the history books that we're using in 10th grade or in 12th grade are actually healthy or accurate or reasonably true, right? And so that's part of it. And I certainly need to do more myself. I've only spoken at a few high schools. That's such an important thing for an author like myself to be able to do. And I relish the opportunity to get more into that world. Yes.
How long did it take you to write?
I researched this book. It took me about 10 years of very active, very dedicated research work. As I said, the bibliography is about, not the bibliography, the footnotes are about 50 pages long. And the writing itself, because I've been doing this for a long time, meaning writing, the writing itself took me maybe a little shy of 2 years. Once I start writing a book, I'm very disciplined. I don't start writing a book till I till I have a pretty clear idea of where I want to go. And so there's all kinds of writers. There's writers who's kind of piece it together in front of the computer. I try to map it out before I get seated in front of the computer. Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of, I can't say piggyback off her question about
Right.
school, but today in our culture, you hear a lot of talk about anti-CRT, right? And no CRT in school, which we all know. But can you talk a little bit about, we know that slavery has existed for almost ever.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between slavery in Africa and this slave trade that began by the Portuguese?
Sure.
And some of that, because our kids are learning that, oh, well, your own people sold your people into slavery.
Sure. This is a very important question, and in the compression that I had to exercise in telling this story, I skipped over that. Sao Tome, this little tiny island that I guess many of you maybe never heard about, and I'm not chastising you. It's not a place that gets talked about very much. Sao Tome is an absolutely critical place in terms of modern history, in terms of modernity, in terms of us sitting here today. This is not only where the prison industrial labor camp system comes into full form, nearly final form. It's perfected in this little tiny island. But it's also where chattel slavery is born. Chattel slavery is an absolutely unique thing in world history. So what do I mean by chattel slavery? When I say chattel slavery, I mean a system wherein people are designated as legitimate targets of enslavement on the basis of their race, and that their enslavement is transgenerational. And that's why it's called chattel. Chattel has the same root as two other important words. Cattle. So if you have a cow or a horse, and that horse or cow has foal or offspring, naturally the offspring belong to you too. This is a key central feature of chattel slavery, which was not, generally speaking, a feature of slavery that has existed since time immemorial in almost every part of the world. And you add to it this racial component, and you have a new system. And so this is born on Sao Tome and then transmitted into the New World and becomes a matter of law throughout the New World under the Western colonial regimes that quickly begin to take shape, right? In Africa, where, as the questioner rightly said, slavery has also long existed, long before Europeans ever set foot in Africa, slavery was conducted on a very different basis. Now, I'm not here to tell you that I would have ever wanted to be born as a slave in Africa or anywhere else. I don't think anybody wants to say that they'd like to be born a slave, no matter how you define slavery. But African slavery as an institution, generally speaking, I think this is widely accepted in the scholarship, was an entirely different kind of creature than chattel slavery. The preoccupation of African rulers in the pre-imperial era was how to acquire how to enlarge our societies. In other words, how do we get more numbers effectively of citizens? And the traditional way of doing this was through conquest. So it was not about territorial aggrandizement, it was about getting more people. And so you defeat the neighboring kingdom, or you have a rival kingdom, and there's wars back and forth, and you capture the people of those kingdoms, and your priority very quickly becomes assimilating the captives into your society, not drawing a hard line between them and you to say that here forevermore you guys are the slaves and we are the masters. Why not? Because that, first of all, requires prison industrial labor camp policing. Secondly, the people will many times will revolt against you. And thirdly, the ones who don't revolt will try to flee, and it's hard to contain them. So they're trying to assimilate the slaves or the enslaved into their societies as quickly as possible. And there's a great variety of experiences here, but as a general rule, it takes place like this. The women are very quickly accepted into the local culture, and the men typically have a time period that they must pass through in order for them to achieve freedom. And the time period is typically associated with kind of young manhood. Once they're out of young manhood, they're not considered a threat, and they're able to circulate freely into the society. This is kind of classic, typical pattern. The women very quickly are married, and so the chattel thing about transgenerational, it's the exact opposite. The children, the offspring of enslaved peoples in the typical African setting, are automatically citizens with full rights of the master society. There is no taint, there's no prejudice. First of all, there's no color difference by and large. There is no political prejudice or penalty from the fact that their parents had been slaves, right? And the proof of this is, in case after case, and there are dozens and dozens of them, the offspring of slaves then rise to become the rulers in the society that they assimilated into. No comparison with chattel slavery. Again, I'm not here to say I would want to have been a slave, even under those circumstances, but these, institutionally speaking, in terms of the arrangements of power, are completely different. There's much more to say. The other thing to say is that Africans didn't have, two things really quickly. The Africans didn't have an idea of themselves as Africans. Why would they have an idea of themselves as Africans if everybody is African? Europeans had an idea of them as Africans, but these people were not transiting into Europe and coming back to say, hey, wait a second, there are these people called the Europeans who think of us as Africans. This was true all over the world. Asians didn't think of themselves as Asians till the 19th century. Native Americans didn't think of themselves as Native Americans until the 19th century. This is all about the slow realization of the changing power equilibrium and the racial basis of power in these different parts of the world. The final thing to be said is that just like there was no chattel slavery in Africa, the Africans who were selling these human beings into bondage to the Europeans, and I don't wish to present this as a pretty thing, But they didn't know to what purposes these human beings were being put in the New World. It's not like they were offered a trip to the New World to have a tour of the plantations. They didn't have chattel slavery themselves and could not imagine that the white people who they were selling human beings to were putting people into chattel-like situations in a prison industrial labor camp system world, right? And so if you combine all of these things together, you very quickly understand that there's just simply no point of comparison. To anybody who tells you, hey, but the Africans were doing this too, doesn't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Just make one comment first.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. This was phenomenal. It's reminiscent of, I'm sure you're familiar with Exterminate All the Birds.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
When you come back.
Will I come back? Yeah. Oh, I can come back anytime. Was that the question? Anytime. Yeah. I'll come to your high schools too. Oh, absolutely. So what happened in the United States was a laboratory for Nazism, not just with regard to African Americans, but also with regard to Native Americans. Then the previous question was exterminate all the brutes. You know, the Nazis saw American history as kind of the idea laboratory for Nazism, like exterminate the natives, in the Nazi case, which mean the Jews and the Slavs, and make them work in forced labor situations, which gets back to Ali's question, and then, encourage the breeding of a master race to replace them.
We have a book, Hitler's American Model.
Yeah.
I just want to say, to answer the lady's question about why it's not being taught in history, I have to say, I first learned about what she shared about Portuguese, that kind of part of history, from my son, who's an 8th grader, who learned it in his history class, which is very fascinating because I have obviously studied history at my age, different parts of the world, history, different eras, but never this specific. So it is being taught, but I think it depends on the teacher and what they would like to learn.
Sure.
My comment to you, sir, is if you envision looking at slavery on the other part of the world, so the Eastern Asia and India, because African slavery did occur on that part of the world, but no one seems to see much of it. And when I tried tracing my DNA using Ancestry.com,
Mm-hmm.
I found out that I do have linkages in India and Middle East and so on and so forth. And I know there is, I didn't know until I did my Ancestry.com that there is an African village still living as if they're traditional Africans. They're well received. There is even, as far as I could tell,
Mm-hmm.
discrimination, but they're living next to each other for generations.
Mm-hmm. Let me try to answer you quickly. I know Ali wants to get us to the book signing. There was a very important traffic of enslaved Africans into the Middle East, which lasted for many centuries. Again, I do not wish to prettify this. A lot of people died in the process. In the acquisition of slaves, many people died. People didn't just volunteer themselves up to people who came to take slaves away, right? So there were violent processes involved in this, and lots of people, many, many, many millions of people died, right? But the people who ended up in places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Oman and places like that were not chattel slaves. They were typically parts of harems, producing offspring that became assimilated into those societies. There are princes today of the Kuwaiti royal family who are as black as anybody sitting in this room today. And so this is a completely different form of slavery and enslavement than we're talking about with New World and chattel slavery. In India, I know the stories. I'm somewhat familiar with the experience you're talking about, but I don't have a great deal of expertise in it. I know that there are communities in southeastern India where there are substantial, if not huge, but nonetheless substantial communities of people whose ancestry is directly from Africa. I'm fascinated by that. I'm not an expert in India per se. I've been to India, but haven't researched this in depth. My next book this book ends in the end of the Second World War, and my next book is about freedom and decolonization and how the world of African Americans and the world of Africa once connected deeply at the level of politics and ideas, and hoping to sort of regenerate some of that now. I may come back. I'm working on an essay about someone else's book that's about the Middle Eastern slavery right now, but that won't be a book of mine. That'll be published in the New York Review of Books, which I write for fairly often. And so I can't give you an explicit promise by year X I'll have a book about that, but God willing, we can end in that place. Thank you.